Right, I think we'll make a start. So welcome to this webinar that we're co-hosting today. So I'm Sarah Rickard and I manage the Greater Manchester Stroke and Neuro Rehabilitation Network. And we are hosting this today with UKBIF, so the UK Acquired Brain Injury Forum. And the focus of today is on improving the outcomes for people who have neurological conditions and who may be affected by homelessness. And we've got two expert speakers who are going to share with us their expertise today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Ellie, and she's an expert by practice in the field of working with hard to reach adults, and particularly those that have got complex needs, and she's been doing that for about the last 20 years. So she's a practitioner academic and has completed the Adult Social Care Research Internship with the NHS R&D Northwest. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ellie kick off our webinar today, and so over to you, Ellie, and don't forget to be putting those questions in the chat, everybody.
Thank you ever so much for welcoming me here today. This seems like a wonderful opportunity and a privilege, quite frankly. Okay, so we're going to have a little look at safeguarding, and that's with people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness today. And that's because I'm here from the entrenched, which doesn't sound very nice, but the entrenched rough sleeper social work team in Adult Social Care Complex Needs Directorate in Manchester. I lead a team of 6 social workers, and we work with people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. That means that they experience significant health inequality, and people have become entrenched in sleeping rough on our streets, and we'll talk about what that actually means to be entrenched. Today, I guess I hope to demonstrate some of the main problems standing in the way of improving the outcomes for people sleeping rough, and this comes with an ask from yourselves actually, and that is, what can you do as a UKBIF community in solidarity with me to improve the lives of some of the most excluded, disadvantaged, traumatised and misunderstood people in our society? Firstly, I'd like to be clear about what I mean by multiple exclusion homelessness and what makes this different to other forms of homelessness. And I'm going to do this by asking if I can take you back to the pandemic for a moment, please, because we had the Everybody In initiative. And this was the first time in our history where financial investment, political will and legal frameworks, they came together to provide shelter with hotels, B&Bs for safety. And this left the streets of Manchester empty, apart from a group of people that either refused to come indoors or behaved in a way in which their behaviours resulted in them not being able to stay indoors. And in Manchester, we understand this group of people to have become entrenched in sleeping rough. And often they refuse help. They significantly neglect themselves. They behave in ways that are often emotionally dysregulated and impulsive. And we use this unique opportunity to ask why the Everybody In initiative did not work for everyone. And this is where my experience of a research internship programme began to help us understand why people remained on our streets during the pandemic. And evidence from that research began to unveil the context in which people's struggles appear. And that was 48% of people sleeping rough are likely to have experienced acquired brain injuries. I know that seems like a staggering figure to me. And 85% of people sleeping rough are likely to have experienced significant trauma. And these conditions are evidence through research to impact the frontal lobes of our brain, known as our executive functioning. And this is what controls all human behaviour. There are many other conditions that affect our executive dysfunction, such as significant overwhelm and stress. With this in mind, we began to ask ourselves, Did the people that remained on our streets have the capacity and ability to act out their wishes and behave in a way they wanted to? And this is where we begin to understand the difference between homelessness and multiple exclusion homelessness. You see, multiple exclusion homelessness refers to situations where individuals face homelessness alongside other severe social issues, such as substance misuse, mental health. Maybe they've experienced childhood trauma or abuse or neglect, been brought up in care with no primary attachments or love. People experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness often have hidden disabilities and differences that increase their vulnerability and their risk, such as childhood trauma, such as acquired brain injuries, chronic physical and mental health, limited mobility, severe addiction. And it is these overlapping challenges that make it really difficult for people to access support and services, leading to a really significant cycle of social exclusion. Now, this is the tricky bit, because evidence from research such as this one by King's College London, called the Opening the Too Difficult box, actually evidences that one of the barriers to working with people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness are in fact our attitudes, such as describing people that sleep rough as a lifestyle choice, or unwise decision making, or judging substance misuse as a personal moral failure. In safeguarding adult reviews, lessons learnt from deaths, we see the common theme of did not engage, case closed, indicating it was their choice. But what if they did not choose not to engage? What if they did not have the capacity or ability to engage because of their brain injury? If we know from research that 48% of people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness have experienced a brain injury, do we have what we need to empower people to receive help? And I guess ask yourself, how does your role and your organisation see people that sleep rough on our streets? I'm sharing this with you, these wonderful bunch of people, because this is our Monday morning homelessness partnership, and it's quite pioneering in that we work collectively. So in Manchester, our priority is to drive the Care Act to the hardest to reach, the people that sleep on our streets and refuse to come indoors, the people that the Everybody In initiative did not work for. And we do it in collaboration with all these partners. Just look at the knowledge and skills around the table there, and that's why it's pioneering. We value our professional relationships and our interplay in a way that galvanises on our knowledge, skills and resources. And that's because we know that working together is the only solution to working with people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. This forms a proactive, but more importantly, a compassionately driven culture of ensuring that every adult matters on the streets that we work with, forming a team around them. Now, this does not come without its own challenges, because this requires a culture of valuing human connection and relational practices, doing right by the people and navigating system barriers. And to overcome these challenges, we've designed and we deliver our ways of working from evidence from research. For example, the specialist homelessness social work role that team that I manage, it's been designed from the ground up from King's College London. The way that we practice is uses strengthened adult safeguarding responses to homelessness and self-neglect. And for those of you that might be familiar with the local government association, care and treatment in homelessness, it underpins the way that we work. Now, I am a social worker, so therefore I'll talk to you about our main piece of legislation that we use, and it is the Care Act, because it plays a crucial role in addressing the complex needs of individuals experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about this for a minute, because as a UKBIF community that raises awareness of acquired brain injury in Parliament and amongst policymakers, my primary objective is the same as yours, is to ensure that people with an acquired brain injury have early access to local specialist services in the community that they need. ensuring health, housing and social care equity to improve people's ability to have better outcomes and better lives with choice, dignity, autonomy. However, as with most pieces of legislation, the Care Act is open to interpretation. And the Care Act actually struggles to reach the hardest to reach, the people sleeping rough on our streets. But the essence of the Care Act is to support inclusion, not exclusion. And when applied creatively, can prevent the development of complex needs when working with people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. Because the Care Act mandates local authorities to conduct comprehensive assessments of individuals' care and support needs. And this includes evaluating physical, mental health, social care needs and housing requirements. Local authorities have a duty to provide services that prevent or delay the development of care and support needs. And this can involve early intervention strategies, such as providing temporary accommodation and access to healthcare services, whilst we assess needs for care and support and the design of multidisciplinary support plans. The Act places adult safeguarding on a statutory footing, emphasising the protection of individuals from abuse, neglect, and this includes addressing self-neglect, which is common, really common amongst people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. The Care Act also encourages collaboration between different agencies, including health services, housing providers, social care teams, and it is this multidisciplinary approach that ensures all aspects of an individual's needs are addressed comprehensively. The Act prioritises the well-being of individuals, ensuring that care and support service promote independence, social inclusion, and improve quality of life. By focusing on these areas, the Care Act aims to provide a safety net for those experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness, helping to prevent the escalation of complex needs and promoting better outcomes and better lives. However, with all that in mind, you'll understand why our team's priority has been to increase Care Act assessments, Care Act inclusion, to mitigate multiple exclusion and disadvantage. And let me just share some stark facts that really highlight multiple exclusion. So our team is relatively new, operational from September 2023. And one of the first things I was curious about and did as a new manager of the team was to ascertain how many people entrenched in sleeping rough on our streets in Manchester had Care Act assessments. 4 out of 90. Just 4 out of 90. In my world, the front line of social work, I know that many people on the streets need our help. They are often poorly, but quite frankly, they're some of the most traumatised people in our society. And I know this because I've heard their stories of lived experience that they've shared with me for the last 20 years. So to me, it's obvious that they have needs for care and support, that they're neglecting themselves to distressing levels. They've lost hope and developed apathy to such an extent that they're not able to engage with help to protect themselves and improve their health and well-being. So you see, we've been on a bit of a mission, and since September 23, we've increased those Care Act assessments from just that 4% to 91%. And by driving the Care Act in this way, with professional curiosity, we're beginning to understand why someone might behave the way they do. What was their journey to the streets? And we're seeing people being unveiled, the context in which people's struggles appear. And this is often reflective of hidden disabilities and differences, like a brain injury, that impacts their executive functioning and therefore the way that people behave. Now, this is Richard. I'd like to introduce you to Richard because Richard is just one example of many people why the Everybody Initiative did not work for. He had 18 different temporary accommodation placements during the pandemic. So this isn't about homelessness, is it? If we're able to provide 18 different temporary accommodation placements. And we provided those 18 because he kept getting evicted because of the way he behaved. Sit back for a minute, please, and allow me to share with you Richard's lived experience. Richard, a father of 2, was married to Sarah. Their life wasn't your average, actually. They had opportunities aplenty. Richard was a director headed for a global leadership role at one of Manchester's most prestigious law firms. But one Friday, the eve of a family holiday to Mauritius, he's waiting at a traffic light in his car. The traffic light is red, and so it is for Tom, coming from the south. Only Tom doesn't see the red light and sadly takes his last breath the moment his car collides with Richard's. Richard's life is saved. He wakes up from a coma in hospital 5 days after the accident. He suffered a head injury. 2 weeks later, he's back home with Sarah and his daughters. However, Sarah and his family do not recognise him. He's angry, frustrated, lashes out, forgets things, and he doesn't look after himself. His anger results in Richard lashing out at his wife, and this was to be the first of many such incidents. For Sarah, this had to stop. Richard moves in with a friend, and then another friend, putting up with him for a matter of weeks before he turned on them too. He began sleeping rough on the streets of Manchester. Once a considerate and loving person, was harassing people for money to pay for his next bottle of whiskey. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet Richard. Richard drinks alcohol all day, every day, and he's become entrenched in sleeping rough on the streets of Manchester. As I said, Richard is like many people we work with that the Everybody In initiative did not work for. Fast forward 10 years, Richard's lived experience fades, and we see Richard as a drinker with antisocial behaviour who self-neglects. We forget to ask, what was his journey to the streets? Because Richard's story started with a head injury and trauma from the car accident, and this changed his behaviour. Richard has hidden disabilities and differences that we cannot see that impacts his executive functions, the part of the brain that controls how we as human beings behave. And because we can't see them, it is conditions of brain injuries and post-traumatic stress disorder where people fall through the gap. And these are the gaps in housing, health, care and support for longer term, psychologically trauma-informed design, delivery and commissioning of supported accommodation and practices for people like Richard that have a brain injury and trauma and use substances, often, as they describe, as a survival need to cope. So if you fall through that gap, homelessness, it's not rare, brief and unrepeated. This is where people like Richard become severely multi-disadvantaged, excluded in society, and then go on to develop complex needs. And this is where huge health inequalities live. This is where we experience humanitarian and financial cost to our citizens and our communities. In Manchester, we believe it's critical that we all know about executive functioning, because executive function is a set of cognitive processes that provide us with the skills to get things done, set goals, make plans, see them through. They're the skills of our own self-awareness, our ability to control our emotions and behaviours. They're the skills that allow us to have the capacity and ability to act out our wishes and be who we want to be. And when these processes are compromised, this is called executive dysfunction. And as I said, it can be hidden and it's hard to spot. An acquired brain injury, alcohol-related brain damage, alcohol fetal syndrome, post-traumatic stress disorder, to name but a few, are all evidenced to impact our executive functioning and therefore the way we behave, like Richard. Now, with Richard using the Care Act, the executive functioning wheel that I just showed you, that wheel there, and a team around Richard under adult safeguarding, we were able to stabilise Richard in temporary accommodation, working alongside our homelessness directorate. And what we found was that Richard could not remember where he was staying, who was supporting him, or when and how much money he received. We carried out a basic but cognitive assessment just to gauge an idea of his cognitive ability. Richard scored 12 out of 30, demonstrating a significant cognitive impairment. We then began to carry out mental capacity assessments in specific decisions around residency, care and treatment and finances, all of which we soon discovered he did not have capacity. And what I mean by that is he was not able to retain, recall, weigh up or communicate on any of those decisions. Richard was assessed under the Care Act that his housing, health, care and support needs could not be met in hostel accommodation. And the Mental Capacity Act asks us to optimise Richard's ability to make decisions in the first instance. So therefore, Health and Social Care funded Richard to be placed in a specialist brain injury unit to optimise cognitive recovery and establish the facts from neuropsychology, occupational therapy assessments of how his brain injury impacted his daily functioning. And 12 weeks later, Richard was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, from the trauma of the car accident, traumatic brain injury from the car accident, alcohol-related brain damage. Remember, he'd been on the streets for 10 years. He'd been drinking whiskey. And he was assessed as having executive dysfunction in emotional regulation, impulse control, task initiation, planning and prioritising. But perhaps what is most harrowing is the dysfunction in Richard's working memory. Because he was assessed as only being able to remember the last 3 words that I've just said. The rest of his communication was filled with confabulation. Can you imagine what the personal challenges must have been like for Richard trying to live with this level of impairment on the streets? But up until this point, Richard was understood to be an antisocial, dependent drinker. Good news, Richard now lives in supported accommodation for people with frontal lobe challenges. There's been no further incidents of antisocial behaviour, and that's because staff are trained to work with him in a way that recognises his needs from his frontal lobe challenges. He's back in touch with his family, and Richard says that he feels safe and he's so happy to have his family back. So, for people that the Everybody In initiative did not work for in Manchester, we don't see people that use substances and sleep rough. We see people that are traumatised. We see people with brain injuries. We see people with alcohol-related brain damage, and we see people with complex needs. And we're not suggesting that this is a story of everyone, but these are the stories that people tell us and that they want to be heard. So one solution could be prevention. We need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And the reason I'm here today, and perhaps the challenge that I propose to you today by highlighting why the Everybody initiative did not work for everyone, is now what? And this, I hope you all to understand, is my ask for a call for action, a need to challenge our unconscious bias and that of others, a need for professional curiosity, trying to ask why, a need for empathy, kindness and positive action, and to our government, a need for health, housing and social care to come together for people experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness. And that is in the design, the delivery and commissioning to meet their needs, which is safety. That means psychologically and trauma-informed provisions and practices that place psychological safety and well-being at the forefront for people like Richard and prevent them returning to sleeping rough on our streets time and time again. Thank you for listening to me and people like Richard. My contact details are here. I chair a national peer network alongside King's College London, and it's around what social work can bring to the table when working with multiple exclusion homelessness. And that's actually, I suppose, in line with social work core values: human rights, advocacy, dignity, choice, autonomy. I'll stop sharing my screen and hope perhaps you'll have some questions and we can have an interactive chat. If you'd like to know more about Richard, there's also a video about Beryl and her story that's free to access on YouTube. And if you do access it and it resonates, I'd ask you to perhaps consider sharing it far and wide for impact for change on how the UK sometimes views people that sleep rough on our streets. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ellie. That was really interesting. I don't know, people know me. I'm a magistrate, and actually on Friday I'm sitting in court, and I have to say we see lots of Richards, and I always remind my other members of my bench that, you know, sometimes people's behaviours are often as a result of brain injuries, etc. And I would say it is depressingly sad, but we do see lots of people like that, and they move around the criminal justice system. And often their life chances are entirely dependent on the experiences they've had. So thank you for summarising. I think really bringing to life, I think we can dehumanise people and see people as just not wanting to engage. So that was a really good summary. I think, Gerard, you had your hand up first. I'm going to introduce you in a minute, but if you're welcome to introduce yourself now if you'd like to.
Hi, Ellie, and thank you for that very interesting chat. Very insightful for everyone. Ellie, my question is really, how can what we've called the UKBIF community help the problems that there are out there? And to that end, what if you had a wish list of how to improve the system, to improve outcomes, what will be number one on the wish list? Is it about the regulations to the Care Act being better drafted, perhaps amended to highlight executive dysfunction as something to be aware of? Over to you. I'd like to know in what way we can sort of raise the banner and change things for the better as an organisation having to promote that.
Well, thanks, Gerard. It's not very often I get asked what's my wish list, so this is great. Firstly, I think my wish list would be valuing and investing in the homelessness social work role certainly in England. I think, and the reason I suggest that is when I differentiate between homelessness and multiple exclusion homelessness, like any specialism, we train to use legislation and to see things differently. And I think it is the trauma-informed social work role and the asking why that is less system-led and more person-centred led, relational-led, perhaps have smaller caseloads. We are one of the few statutory teams of 6 specialist homelessness social work roles in the country, and King's College London are publishing documentations around this needing to grow as a resource, so investing in the workforce so that we can capture and use the Care Act in that way. And then once we start using the Care Act in that way and we start capturing unmet care and support needs, and what I mean by that is the unveiling of somebody like Richard that is actually homeless because of unmet care and support needs, and that is because of his cognitive impairment, his brain injury. But you heard the big one there, I think, for me, is around challenging our own unconscious bias and that of others, and this notion perhaps of how we judge people to be deserving or non-deserving. So if we just remove the substances, the whiskey, away from Richard, how would we view Richard? Because once upon a time, Richard was married with a family, and he was, you know, on a trajectory to be a high-flying lawyer, and then we forget all that and we just see this antisocial dependent drinker. And then I suppose you made reference to the executive functioning wheel. I mean, yes, I passionately believe that wheel helps everybody, not just social workers, but everybody just be curious about the way people behave. And Manchester's that passionate about it. It is embedded in our Care Act assessments and our Mental Capacity Act assessments. And by no means is it to diagnose people, not at all. But it is to start moving our initial judgments that perhaps is around moral failure and decision and wise decision making, to just scratching the surface and asking why. Like if we just ask why, we start seeing a story, and then hopefully that story engages our basic human nature of empathy, kindness.
Can I just a quick one, follow up? Is the Manchester practice common throughout the country, or are you a unique team? And if you are unique, should you be sharing your good practice? Should there be a code of good practice to be followed?
Thank you. Another good question, Gerard. I've learnt to understand of late that what we do in Manchester is very differently. And I know that because I was invited by the Minister of Housing, Rushanara Ali, to present at their Health, Housing and Social Care Working Together event, which was to highlight practice of excellence that's working, and Manchester were at the table there. And then only last Monday I was at the Homeless Link National Conference, moving from crisis to prevention as a local authority, highlighting what we're doing in Manchester, because I want to close the equity gap for all, and a better understanding of people on the streets across the country, not just in Manchester.
Gerard is a member of the UKBIF and is also a renowned King's Counsel, or Silk, who specialises in brain and spinal injury, both in children's and adults. He's got a wealth of experience and deals with claims for a variety of different disorders. So his practice for the last 30 years has been exclusively for claimants. And he enjoys getting to know people and building relationships with them, which often last for many years. So his driving force is around achieving justice and fair compensation for those who have injury. And he's here to talk to us today about his experiences and reflections on that. So I'll pass over to you, Gerard.
I'm hoping that I've shared my PowerPoint with you. Can somebody, Karen?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can see.
That's great. Thank you very much. Then good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Ellie. She's an inspirational speaker and doing great work. And at UKBIF and with the Northwest branch of UKBIF that this is being presented by, we're all very keen to do what we can to help Ellie's task and to spread the news and discuss and share information and problem solve around the rough sleeping issue. Let me move on to link up my talk with Ellie's talk and take you back to Richard's case. Probably there aren't many lawyers in the audience today, and this, I'm afraid, I'll try and keep it as non-legal as possible. But the link is this: had Richard had a lawyer looking after him in terms of picking up his broken life following the accident, perhaps Richard would have been in a better place. And so I'm here really spreading the news to non-lawyers that lawyers can make a difference to people like Richard, to the rough sleepers that unfortunately come by accidents in which they sustain serious injuries and are made even more vulnerable than they already were. In Richard's case he wasn't, but often it's the rough sleepers that we come across who've found that they're yet again involved in an accident. So it's about spreading the news that with legal assistance help can be provided. Looking at this first slide, what we're talking about is coming along when the accident has occurred. From a legal perspective, we're looking at how do we come in and help the person, and we start by really saying to ourselves, well, what are the difficulties, the complexities that are involved in the case? is there a way in which they can be managed such that we can win the case, gain compensation for the injured person, and improve his life? So that's where we're coming from. The two cases I'm going to refer to first involved a middle-aged lady who was being housed in accommodation provided by the local authority for homeless people. Unfortunately, the building wasn't safe, the systems were wrong, the securing mechanisms on the window were inoperative, and she fell out of the window. Unfortunately, before she'd fallen, she was already an amputee. She fell 4 floors and broke her spine. The other was a rough sleeper, homeless person who was crossing a very busy 3-lane carriageway in a city centre. He was walking quite slowly, and a driver who was paying no attention whatsoever just piled into him and caused a very severe brain injury. From the lawyer's point of view, the first issue for us is we have to win our case. We have to prove our case, and to do so may often require relying upon the person who's been knocked down or fallen out of the window. Now, their reliability as to historians of what happened in the accident is highly likely to be compromised, either by the injury or by a combination of the injury and their pre-existing mental health problems, and possibly history of earlier acquired brain injury. So it's almost a starting point that they're not going to be people who are able to be good recollectors of what happened in the accident. So the lawyers have to look around and see, is there any other way that we can prove what happened? So CCTV is very important. Thankfully, in our cities and towns, there's usually quite a lot of CCTV cameras available, but sometimes they're of no assistance. Sometimes they are. If there are marks on the road, on the ground, if there is factual evidence from which a reconstruction expert, someone who reconstructs how the accident happened, if they can work with that kind of material, again, that's of assistance to us. One of the key things to do from the start is to try and get, as soon after the accident as is feasibly possible, accounts from the injured party and any eyewitnesses of how the accident happened. Next slide, please. So from the non-lawyer's point of view, I hope you can see that there is very often a real issue as to, can we prove what happened? Taking you back to Richard's case, he was minding his own business when a driver coming the wrong way failed to stop at a red light and smashed into him. That speaks for itself. But you can imagine that in the case I've described of the man crossing 3 lanes of the carriageway, if he was on his own with no eyewitnesses and the defendant was saying nothing, you'd be struggling. Thankfully, in his case, there was CCTV footage. So that's one of the problems that we have to risk assess and manage and see whether we can make good any particular weaknesses in the case. The next thing is we look to see what our strategy in the case should be. And in this case, or in both cases, the local authority had come to the rescue once the accident had happened. The insurer for the party in fault was not assisting, so it was down to, well, what happens in the interim? Who's going to look after these badly injured people? And the local authority, fortunately, in both cases stepped in. They had to, because they were clearly people who were very vulnerable and who were in need. So they were being accommodated and looked after by the local authority, but in unsatisfactory conditions. What happened in both cases really were that the placements were not really appropriate. There were lack of places to put people, one with a significant spinal injury, the other with a very severe brain injury. For example, the man with a very severe brain injury ended up in a old people's care home, which was not appropriate at all, but was the only available place at the time. And what we're trying to do is build a strategy that says to the insurer who's responsible for picking up the bill if we prove fault, this is what we want to do, this is where we're going in terms of trying to rehabilitate the injured person. And our strategy is as follows. Because we're dealing with people who will have very long-standing addictions, it's about, as well, trying to persuade an insurance company that they run the risk that if we go to court, a judge will say yes, this person needs to be rehabilitated, and that means treated for, if appropriate, treated for his addiction, together with what other injuries have been caused in the accident. What I'm saying to you is we have to present a realistic strategy to our opponents, and also, if it comes to it, to a judge who might hear the case. And as I say in the bottom bullet point, it's difficult in this type of case, because often the client whose addiction has not been treated and isn't being treated because he's not in the right setting, at best is superficially abiding by the instructions that he's given by those who are trying to help him, i.e. the rehab team. But it's very difficult, because until you put them in the right placement, the problems continue. Next slide. So in the example of the homeless person who was knocked down crossing the road, we found it hugely difficult to find an appropriate placement, a residential rehabilitation setting that would treat, or was even, sorry, I'll start that one again, who was willing to accept a patient who had long-standing addictions plus a severe brain injury. We kept finding that you would get institutions that would deal with one or the other, drink problems, drug problems, addictive problems, but could not treat at the same time, or in combination as it were, the problems of a severe brain injury. And it took us a great deal of time, and eventually the Transitional Rehabilitation Unit at St Helens was really the only place that could help us for a client who'd had his accident in the Midlands, and True, which is, after all, its outreach, its net, as it were, is nationwide. It's got a great reputation. True was the only place that we could find to solve the problem. But at least, having trawled through many different options, at least we found a solution. So we had a strategy. We wanted to put in True, and the cost was substantial. You see it set out there. But the problem was waiting times to admit were also a problem. But this was our route. This was our pathway, and we said that's where he's going. If we win this case, that's our presentation. And so that's what we said to the insurer. Next slide. So what was important in the presentation was to show that TRU was the right place, had a good track record of success in terms of treatment of both addiction and brain injury, such that we could say to the court, this is realistic. This is something that has a reasonable prospect of improving the outcome for this person. The lead clinical psychologist at TRU was very helpful in providing the statistics for success and in showing or demonstrating what the treatment path at TRU would be. So all of this was good news from our point of view. It helped with the presentation, and I'm glad to say it ultimately succeeded, which I'll come to shortly. So let's move on with the slides. So the presentation for this type of case involves taking it one stage further beyond the residential placement to where next after that. So discharge into the community from TRU. So this is all the preparation that we're doing. We haven't even got in TRU at this stage, but we've got to show that we've got an end result in mind, and again that it's practical and realistic. And the presentation was that there was no reason why our client could not, following a significant period at TRU, go back and live in his own home, probably a flat close to other family members, with support. His brain injury was such that he would never be able to live independently, i.e. on his own, but with support workers with him and a case manager, there was no reason why he couldn't. We had to anticipate that it was likely that he might want to leave, and we had to show that the law was sufficiently facilitating enough, as in a deprivation of liberty order attaching to the home address, that this could be done. Because we could foresee that there would be times, even following his rehabilitation and in reasonable accommodation, he would just get up and go. So we had to show that all these risks could be managed. So moving on, please, again. So clearly, in all of these cases, a capacity assessment is fundamental. And again, it's likely to be a comprehensive assessment that covers not only finances and health, but also litigation, basically every aspect of life, capacity assessments being issue specific. So there arises in this type of case whether there is a disorder of the mind. It doesn't necessarily follow. For example, you could have a case, the lady who fell out of the window case didn't end up with a brain injury. She ended up with a broken spine. But so far as capacity was concerned, did she have a disorder of the mind? And the answer was yes, she did. If we move on, thank you. Her diagnosis included an emotionally unstable personality disorder, which would explain really a great deal of the misfortunes that had befallen her before she had her accident. A person with a personality disorder is dysfunctional. But in addition, she would have had, and had at the time following the accident, depression and anxiety. She had her addictions, but the MCA requires you not to take into account drug addiction in terms of assessment. She was suffering significant amounts of pain, which again would interfere with her cognitive processes. And we had a consultant psychiatrist said the combination of all of those problems amounted to a disorder of the mind, such that he could come to a conclusion that she lacked capacity, which was important, obviously, in terms of the way she would be assisted in terms of management decisions, etc., and also the need for help from a deputy and the costs of that. So I'm emphasising that there are problems in this type of case, but they're solvable with, fingers crossed. You can't say that they'll always be solvable, but with a following wind, hopefully they are. In the lady who fell out of the windows case, So we've got the disorder of the mind. She fitted the MCA in terms of its requirements, its functional and diagnostic requirements. And one of the things the psychiatrist was saying was that the thing that mostly got in the way of her ability to weigh up information was that the only thing that really concerned her thought processes were how to feed her addiction. And that was clearly a big obstacle to the way she thought. Again, in her case, the psychiatrist said, obviously it's all time specific, and with treatment perhaps she may regain capacity, which was good news from her point of view. Next slide, please. This is a bit technical now. I think we can I'll summarise this to say that if you are recovering only modest damages, you don't want those modest damages to be eaten up by the costs of the deputy, which can be substantial. It's a big problem where you've not got huge amounts of money. My experience has been that the Court of Protection and civil court judges do not like doing without the safety net of the Court of Protection, so you can propose trusts and the like, but I come across judicial reluctance to go down that route, and trusts themselves can be quite expensive. Moving on, please. Again, that's a slide about how to avoid the costs of the deputy. In reality, if the damages are fairly modest, usually what we find is that the first priority is to provide safe accommodation, and in terms of a capital purchase, that might well substantially eat up quite a large amount of the damages, and therefore there's not very much left over for the deputy to administer. So the role of the deputy ceases to be of great importance, but you've at least found a safe haven, as it were, that meets with the approval of the client, hopefully. Right, moving on, please. Sometimes it happens that because the person injured lacks capacity, a litigation friend is appointed, and then the litigation friend proves to be unreliable. You can see how complex these cases can become, and the short answer is that there is a provision that enables a court to remove a litigation friend. They are the people who make decisions, but when they demonstrate they cannot act competently and fairly in the best interest of the person injured, then the lawyers have the power to go to the court and say, remove this person and appoint someone else. Thank you very much. Moving on. It can be a problem. A professional deputy can be the person. If nobody else is available, then a professional deputy. If the person lacks capacity, the official solicitor is the final point of call if you haven't got a deputy. But I'm getting too intricate perhaps in law, so let's move on. So accommodation is a big issue. Ellie's presentation highlights that this type of person, client, they're vulnerable, and their idea of what is safe needs reinforcement and needs a great deal of thought about where is appropriate for them. I think I just want to stress that conventional ideas may not be enough. Just putting it like this, that a rough sleeper can have had a very unpleasant experiences in what were supposed to be safe houses, safe premises, safe institutions that proved less than safe, and the amount of anxiety around accommodation for the client may be very substantial, and you have to be aware of it. Okay, moving on. The way we calculate compensation in this country is that generally, and speaking in very broad terms, you try to put the person back into the position they were as much as money can before the accident. But what you're trying to do is to restore a degree of their physical health, their mental health, and that requires support workers in this context to be available. And what we do is we work out the yearly cost and then multiply that by what we are advised is the life expectancy of someone in a similar circumstance to that of your client. So we as lawyers bear in mind that the life expectancy is bound to be not normal. There will be negative factors in play, and I list a number of those. Obviously, alcohol and drug addiction causes a decrease in life expectancy for well-known reasons, and there can be others through various combinations of pre-existing vulnerability, the accident injuries and immobility caused by those injuries. For example, weight gain and immobility becomes a problem in some cases, and that also is a negative factor so far as life expectancy is concerned. So all of these things have to be managed. Moving on. The good news, the positive life expectancy factors are that you've usually got a rehabilitation team, you've got a care package, you've got financial support via a deputy, and the protection of that deputy and the court of protection, so that funds are managed and not wasted. Thank you. Moving on. I think just to say this, that in the one case, and the man who was knocked over in the road, his care package going forward was the cost of the deputy plus the injury award. We settled the case at just over £2 million for that person. That's only to emphasise what the message is, that if you're aware that a client that you're dealing with, a rough sleeper, has had an accident, not to forget that there can be assistance by going to see a lawyer. I don't mean physically him going to see a lawyer, because that's unlikely, but the lawyer coming to see the rough sleeper or whatever. Being hospital visits are common. Access to the law is what I'm trying to advocate in a roundabout way, that lawyers can really help when misfortune hits someone who's already had plenty of trauma in their lives. So poor old Richard might have, as I say, been greatly assisted had he had legal help at the time. I don't know anything about Richard's case, and it may be that was investigated, so I don't want to tread on any toes, but it's a good example. If there was no legal help, that with legal help he might have had a different trajectory. Thank you. Moving on. I don't think we need to pause there. Next slide, please. It's a difficult case. We fought it at trial in order to prove that the premises that she was living in, provided by the local authority, were unsafe, and we won our case, and we ended up with a smaller amount of money, but nevertheless largely around looking after her by way of care. But in her case it was even more difficult because she wouldn't accept care, but she would accept it. It was a not uncommon case, actually. There was one person whose help she would accept, who happened to be a social worker, Ellie, if Ellie's listening, and she trusted the social worker, and we were able to say, well, with the right approach we can build on that, and she will in time allow other people in, so that we did have a care claim for her, but I'm highlighting that this is a type of case where getting the rough sleeper to trust people is obviously very difficult, but there were the beginnings of that. So that was a glimmer of hope. It meant we didn't get her as much as we could have done, but you have to work with the facts that you're given. So the insurer, when you meet in negotiation, is always going to say, this plan of yours will never work. This long-term addict will remain an addict, and it's not going to work. And they say that, and the answer is, well, we're going to court, we think it will. And then the insurer will assess the risk of us winning, and he does his risk assessment and makes or doesn't make his offer. But in the right hands, perhaps, you maximise your opportunities and come to assess the risk to your own client and come to a suitable settlement. So moving on again, come to the end. All it needs from you, that slide is directed towards lawyers, is patience, empathy, wisdom and courage. And I think Ellie, if she were listening, and I think she is, would agree that the same applies to social workers and to anyone who deals with this type of client, the rough sleeper. Patience, empathy, wisdom and courage. We all have to hang on in there and do our best to help our clients. So I hope that encourages you to think creatively if you're met with how do I do my best to help a rough sleeper in circumstances where he's had an accident. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope you followed the link between Ellie's talk and mine, and I hope you feel that we working together can do our best to move on and improve the situation for those who have the misfortune to have their lives on the streets now. So there it is. As I said before, UKBIF is about joining with all like-minded people to help those who've had acquired brain injuries improve their situation and get better outcomes. So I would encourage you, if you're of like minds and are not members of UKBIF, to join it, and likewise to come and join the Northwestern group if you're in this area. Our job is to bring people together, share information and expertise, and do our best to improve the situation for the ABI community. 48% of rough sleepers have ABI, have had. So it's obviously an area of concern for us. Thank you very much for listening. Over to Sarah.
Picking up on your point, I think certainly I'm I've joined the UKBIF, UKBIF or UKBIF, tomato. I've joined the forum, and I think people are always a bit suspicious of companies, and whether it be pharmaceutical or law firms, and I wasn't suspicious, but I didn't understand it. But I think you've kind of neatly described how the system actually needs different parts to work, and I think the people I've worked with and come into contact with who come from a legal background and who work in brain injury are very passionate. And I think, having spoken to you and others, I think you're often long-standing relationships with people and seeing what they're having to face and how you can help them effectively get what they're owed, so that actually they can live a better life. I think certainly coming from the NHS, we need to embrace that, and we need to be supportive of that. Obviously, you're a private business, you do your thing, but actually I think the enthusiasm and the passion that I encounter with people, I think it really is around doing the right thing for people, and we need lawyers to do that. So I think you kind of gave a good summary. I just wondered, actually, and this might be a question for both of you, just around multidisciplinary working and how that works in practice. I think, Ellie, you showed a really good slide at the beginning about how all the different agencies that might need to come together. And I'm conscious of it really in the NHS, how we're not always as good at doing that, although I think with neurorehabilitation we're probably better than some specialties. I just wonder, Gerard, whether what reflections you had on the kind of the richness of working together and kind of interdisciplinary working, whether that be legal or health, and how that kind of works for you.
In my world, there are two different teams, as it were. There's a team that is specialist in presenting expert evidence to courts, so the medical legal team, and then there are the rehab team, clinicians, therapists who are there getting the client better, doing the work on the ground. Two distinct teams, but they have to be teams, and if they're not, if they're all doing their own thing, the rehab doesn't work. So it's the same thing, I'm sure, for everybody. It has to be teamwork to get the right outcome.
Yeah, Ellie?
Just the needs of people are often complex and layered, and to Gerard's point, the rehab team will be a multidisciplinary team in its own right, in which you'll have psychology and occupational therapists, speech and language, social work, all that kind of. And I said that multidisciplinary team is, in my mind, what gets the best out of someone. And they might not all have the same relationship with the individual. Gerard made reference to trusting relationships, and it doesn't matter who that is, but I suppose if one can develop a trusting relationship with someone, then the benefit of a multidisciplinary team is that trusted worker can be the advocate, the voice, and spread what that person wants and how to get the best out of them to the rest of the team, which then means that we all work in a similar way and in a way that gets the best out of the individual.
And I suppose that's about being truly needs led, because you're focusing on their needs rather than how you work and your team, and that's what often, I think, my experience gets in the way. It's often kind of organizational differences, cultural ways of working differences, and actually you're not really focusing on what you're doing and the person that you're doing it for. You're more focusing on the organization of how you work and how you may or may not be able to work together. So from Lawrence, should police officers that deal with vulnerable adults, including those with brain injury, be specially trained? I feel that might be a loaded question. I'll start with you, Ellie, first.
I can only go off my own experience, but again, in Manchester, which seems to be a bit of a pioneering city in terms of trauma-attuned approaches, we have what we call the Street Engagement Hub in Manchester at one of our third sector provisions, the Mustard Tree. And the idea behind that is it's a one-stop shop where people's care and support needs can be met and signposted on, but the main referrers to that hub are some local city centre police officers that do work in a trauma-informed way, that err on the side of trying to really be proactive about making sure people receive care and support rather than go down the criminal justice route in the first instance. And they are part of that Monday morning homelessness partnership meeting, and in some ways I've described them as most definitely allies, but they're social workers with Greater Manchester Police powers alongside, and together that's a great example of how instead of working from our own organisation's agendas, we can meet the bespoke needs of the people that we're here to serve. I hope that answers the question.
No, I mean, I would reflect on my experience working in the criminal justice system on a part-time basis. Is that, I mean, we run in Manchester, they do run a mental health court, which I know is not exactly the same, but it is more focused on people who have complex needs, and sometimes those mental health needs are as a result of brain injury. And although that's only really quite recent, and I was really struck that actually how is it taken so long to acknowledge that, particularly those people in the criminal justice system, and there are an awful lot of homeless people. Most homeless people will probably encounter the criminal justice system at some point by design or just because of falling through the net. But yeah, how poorly provisioned it is, or poorly trained people are in dealing with actually quite a large majority of the people that are going through the system. So I think training's really, really important. I don't know, Gerard, if you have any. Obviously your experience as a lawyer is probably
I'm a civil barrister, not a criminal barrister, but I would say that my guess would be that there probably is training that's beginning now, but it isn't as extensive as it should be, would be my guess. So I'm in agreement with the questioner, but yes, there should be general training for every police officer, but I suspect we don't have it, and I hope one day we'll get there. We should do. It needs to be done.
I was just wondering, Ellie, so one of the questions we get thinking about our community neuro rehab teams, and I know that some people on the calls here have probably come from those teams, is that we get people who perhaps need specialist therapy and accessing it, either if they're in prison or if they're on the streets, is often really difficult. So I just wondered what your experiences were in terms of people accessing specialist treatment who might be homeless and have difficulty engaging with services, but also maybe not have the physical location in where they can actually do it.
I think the onus is on us to think creatively how we can engage the person, and again that comes to ways of working and working as a team. In the story with Richard, had our homelessness directorate not offered immediate temporary accommodation as a basic need of safety in the first instance, it was that platform that then allowed the multidisciplinary team to go through a set of step-by-step actions, if you like, which did involve engaging legal literacy, but sometimes we need to use other legal powers. Rather, I think I err on the side of caution with saying this, because I know the Mental Capacity Act always asks us to presume capacity, but when we're talking about people that are experiencing multiple exclusion homelessness and we're offering accommodation and that's not working, I think we can then start travelling a little over to the other side and being far more professionally curious, moving away from the assumption of capacity, because my experience on the front line is that we are unveiling the likes of Richard that had lived on the streets for 10 years without the mental capacity either to reside, to receive care and treatment, to manage finances, and it was legal frameworks, I guess, and funding that optimised, or at least started to optimise his ability to start receiving treatment around his brain injury, but ultimately then start having autonomy, choice. And for me, what's really important is dignity. You know, when people are sat on the streets, often, sometimes in their own urine, I don't know about anybody else on this call, but that seems the most undignified, sad, traumatic way to live out one's life. Wouldn't even say it's living out one's life, is it? It's just surviving.
Do you think as well that obviously we've had a period of, we've also had to change government without really being political, but things have changed potentially since then. But we've obviously had our councils with their budgets cut in half, and services have changed. I mean, I can see that in my own experience. Has that had an impact over the last 10 years? I know Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester has had a big interest in homelessness and obviously trying to get people off the streets, but do you think the access to the other services or access to things that prevent people from becoming homeless has that been a change in terms of what we're able to provide in the last sort of decade or so?
I can only speak on my experience of Manchester, but of course with cuts there comes difficulties in accessing services, and with the new government, again, without getting political, but it's clear there is a drive for cross-government strategy. There feels like there's a real opportunity here to start looking at how we integrate departments. So I made it really clear, multiple exclusion homelessness is complex. It's not a housing issue, but it is a housing, health and social care issue. And how do those departments come together, not only to integrate financially the commissioning, but again galvanizing on the knowledge, skills, resources, policies, legislation, would seem an efficient and effective way of using what we've got. And to Gerard's point, some of these things really aren't expensive. Gerard ended his presentation with empathy, compassion, wisdom, courage. These don't cost anything.
And I also think the other thing, having doing a lot of service improvement with services, is that teams knowing who each other are and talking to each other also costs nothing, and actually better, more professional curiosity, I suppose, about the team upstream or downstream of you, and what other agencies are out there. I think is something that we can all do as professionals. Working together with the resources and assets we've got is another way of it not costing anything. So we have.
Sorry to interrupt. That's the very reason I shared the slide about the Pioneering Homelessness Partnership. You know, you've got all these organisations that every week come together. They're not contracted to. They do it because they know that working together is where the magic is, and it's that culture of working together that is efficient, effective, and improves people's lives and outcomes.
So I think one of the challenges, perhaps, is in terms of what people might take away, is to sit down with yourself and your team, perhaps, and think: are we curious enough? Do we know enough about the teams and the agencies that we're working with, particularly around homelessness? But that might span other areas. So I think. I think thinking back to Richard's accident, which happened 10 years ago, how confident are you now that his rehab needs would have been identified early and that he wouldn't drop out of the system? So if his situation occurred now, do you feel more confident that he would have been picked up?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure, actually. Again, I think it comes down to assuming capacity, and I say this because Richard's one of many that I've worked with in which some people have experienced some level of neurorehabilitation, perhaps finding it very difficult, maybe have had a history of substance misuse, maybe are not in a position to prioritize and understand the impact that rehabilitation period might have on the rest of their life, and knowing that people can be impulsive and perhaps emotionally dysregulated. There is a pattern or a theme that I'm observing that people choose, I say that carefully, but take their own discharge, not fully understanding the consequences of then managing their life without that recovery. And it is that I'm seeing where people are just unable to manage tenancies and do fall into sometimes being cuckooed or just abandoning their properties. And I guess again that takes me back to how curious and robust are our mental capacity assessments and our assessments around people's executive functioning to do that. So by no means am I suggesting that we're heavy-handed, that we're looking at detaining people, that we absolutely ethically shouldn't be. I'm just suggesting, how curious are we, and how sure are we that that is a informed choice, that people take their own discharge?
I think you summarised that really well. Actually, I think it highlights the complexity of capacity when you have multiple layers of complexity within that, which might be to do with people's brain injury, might be to do with their subsequent potential substance abuse, their background. They may have, some people don't have Richard's situation, but grew up in awful situations in care and have PTSD from trauma from childhood. It's when you add all those layers on, how much capacity do people have within I suppose the way that we might currently perform assessments. Are we skilled enough in teasing out those things? I think it's a really interesting point, really difficult, and it's also very, I think the difficulty we have, it's very resource intensive, isn't it? Which is in the current world, it makes things harder to get things right for people with very complicated lives. So second part to Mike's question is, as an ex-social worker himself, he's now client support for Thompson's, I now find most social workers lack access to specialist knowledge and skills, and they're not encouraged to get them. Are you in touch with the Brain Injury Southwest group? Are you able to raise the ABI flag amongst the social worker, sorry, not Southwest, social worker group? So there's obviously a brain injury group for social workers. Social workers, now you're able to raise that amongst the social worker hierarchy. So how much are you able to fly the flag, I think, within your professional community, Ellie?
Great question, and hello to fellow ally social worker Mike. I try and fly the flag as much as my job enables me. I need to manage a team and manage the front line, but also, you know, I give my time to webinars like this for that reason, really. So yes, I am in touch with Biswig, there's Chloe, and there's Mark Holloway. I've presented for themselves as well. And then there's the national peer network of your specialist homelessness social workers that I chair alongside King's College. Exactly that, really, to articulate that this is a specialist homelessness social work role. And some might argue that we should have generic social work, but I do see that, you know, you can either be a jack of all trades, or you can specialise in something and have all the nuanced, subtle knowledge that makes you understand the world in which you practice to the best of your ability. And this is my point, and I think one that I raised at the beginning. I try to advocate for an investment in the specialist homelessness social work role that covers acquired brain injuries, alcohol-related brain damage, post-traumatic stress disorder, and trauma-attuned practice, as well as the other complications that affect our brains and then our behaviours. And the need for, you know, social work should be a relational practice. It's about human beings. The use of self is what I would describe one of my most powerful tools of impacting on someone's life for the better, I would hope.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the discussions we've had, particularly around the network also works in stroke, and during the pandemic we lost social workers off of the wards and also the neuro rehab wards, and actually that loss of not just the role, but actually often people who understood people with neurological impairments. It is a specialism, because particularly the hidden deficits, the ones we've talked about around cognitive, that may not be apparent, that does, I think, add in a different element of expertise that's required to understand, particularly, you know, people's lives, and people behave in particular ways. And if you have a brain injury of whatever type, your behaviour may change, and what you do might change, and your decision making will change. And your ability to live your life as you did before may change. And I think appreciation, understanding of that is really important. I don't know, Gerard, I've just put in the chat function just the UKBIF website. I don't know if you wanted to say anything more about the regional forum and its work, and I don't know if there's a link I need to post or you can post before we finished.
I've already said it, I think, Sarah. UKBIF is very, is doing great work, frankly, on behalf of the ABI community, and bringing together people in Parliament. There's a brain injury strategy that is being brought back into life with the change of government, and hopefully we'll get that moving again. They are very useful as a forum for pursuing the acquired brain injury issues. And can I encourage everyone, if they're not members, to become members? And as I said before, in the Northwest, we'd be hugely welcoming and grateful for anyone who would come and join our Northwest Acquired Brain Injury Forum, one of the subgroups of UKBIF. So please do come and join us. Thank you very much.
I think particularly people who come from, you know, the different organisations, the multidisciplinariness of it all is actually what's important. So there's no point in sitting there with a room full of psychotherapists or not psychotherapists, physiotherapists or just social workers. We we need lots of different backgrounds to kind of contribute. I don't see any more questions. I'm just going to perhaps come back to each of you and maybe just ask you to just quickly, I suppose, if what might be your take-home message, or things that you'd like people to take away from today. I don't know if Ellie, you want to go first, or Gerard? So just kind of in a nutshell, what do you think people should take away? I didn't tell you I was going to do this. I put you on the spot. Sorry.
I think the one ask I would have is just be mindful of our own unconscious bias and that of others. And that's because I've also had to look in the mirror and face that myself, where I've seen the addiction or the substance misuse in the first instance, and then scratched below that, and then seen a whole host of other reasons. So it's easy to just look at what's presented in front of us. So yeah, professional curiosity, ask why.
No, that's a really good point. I have to keep going back to being a magistrate. This is my most kind of close experience of homelessness. But yeah, I always catch myself or catch others on the bench. If anybody ever says something like, well, I wouldn't have done that, it's like, well, no, you wouldn't have done that because you're not that person. You haven't got their lived experience. So yeah, I think you're right. Ask why, and why do people behave in particular ways? That's a good starting point. Excellent. And Gerard, have you got any final thoughts?
My takeaway would be to what I believe will be a non-legal audience listening, take the opportunity to help. And by that I mean, maybe if you see someone in the situation we talked about, the rough sleeper, who's had an accident, take the opportunity to try and steer him towards a lawyer, a competent lawyer who will help, because they can. So it's rather not turning the other way. It's saying, I think I might be able to help here just by making an introduction. So just seizing the moment. Thank you very much.
Well, we'll end by saying, well, thank you very much. I think two really interesting, slightly different talks, but I think tackling a really important topic that I don't think gets talked enough about, but actually impacts services and impacts, importantly, the people, particularly of our region in the Northwest, particularly in Greater Manchester. There's a lot of homelessness still, despite best efforts. And so we are likely to see people in services who are going to need to have specialist support. Thanks once again to everybody who was involved in setting this up, and also speaking. And we look forward to seeing you at another event.